Hello and welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. As always, Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I are joined by Britt Hartley. Britt is a religious trauma and deconstruction coach and atheist spiritual director. Drawing from her study of history and theology and her own experience with religious deconstruction, Britt helps thousands of people every day via her TikTok and Instagram content to navigate the difficult waters of faith transition, existential crisis, and meaning-making. In this interview, we discuss her new book, No Nonsense Spirituality, All the Tools, No Faith Required. We talk about her personal experience with religious deconstruction, secular spirituality, atheism, nihilism, absurdism, all the isms. We'll talk about evolutionary psychology, cognitive biases, the difference between so-called masculine or patriarchal and feminine or matriarchal approaches to ego dissolution and spiritual development, epistemic humility, embodied intuition, how psychedelics can help with religious deconstruction, and much, much more. If you want to learn more about Britt and the work that she does, you can check her out at her website, nononsensespirituality.com, her TikTok and Instagram pages. I believe it's also No Nonsense Spirituality. And of course, you can pick up her book. A couple of announcements for you before we get into the episode. If you're looking for professional training pursuant to becoming a psychedelic-assisted practitioner, check out the courses we offer here at Numinus. You can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/training and use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinus does. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so by leaving us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the episode with someone you think needs to hear it. You can even comment below and tell us what you thought. Without further ado, here's our conversation with Britt Hartley. Welcome back, everybody, to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. Reid and I are honored to be joined by Britt Hartley today. Britt, the author of the recently released book, I'm going to show up my screen here. This is so cool. No Nonsense Spirituality, All the Tools, No Faith Required. Welcome, Britt.
Pleasure to be here.
So I was telling Britt before we hit record that I've been following her content on TikTok primarily, a little bit on Instagram for a long time, and have been super fascinated with her particular journey, not only because we share an original sort of religious origin story as being raised in the Mormon church, but just also the great work that she's done helping people so-called deconstruct and giving them a different or fresh perspective on what spirituality can mean. So Britt, I was wondering if you'd be willing to just sort of start from the beginning and tell us a bit about your particular journey that brings you where you're at today and the work that you do.
Yeah, I'll give a bird's eye view flyby, and then you can dive into anything of note here. But I was raised Mormon, and had a faith crisis, kind of a few faith crises. Eventually lost my faith in Mormonism. Spent some time in Christianity. Spent some time still trying to make sense of God. Eventually got to a place where, even though I was in Christian seminary working on my doctorate in theology, because I really took these questions seriously. I was not a lazy learner, as they say in Mormonism. Eventually lost my faith in God entirely, but with that also lost my sense of morality, my sense of self, free will, community. Everything that God was anchored to everything else, and eventually kind of found my way into nihilism, where I really just had a hard time making sense of life and if it's worth living. The philosopher Albert Camus talks about the first question of philosophy is whether or not to commit suicide, and that was certainly the place that I was after losing all of those psychological and social anchors. Eventually found my way in this spiritual world and religious world that I'd been studying my whole life, found my way through secular spirituality and was able to separate the dogmas that I couldn't believe anymore from the tools that were helpful. And those tools helped me to recover from nihilism and come to a place where I feel like I'm happy to be alive rather than wishing that I wasn't when I was kind of in that hole. And so now I work as an atheist spiritual director, which I realize is a confusing title that I made up, but it best describes that I just help others find spiritual tools for connection and meaning and purpose and awe and transcendence and mindfulness and community and love and all the things that are the good things of life. But I do it without making you jump through hoops of faith and belief, that you don't have to believe in astrology to do that. You don't have to believe in God to do that. You don't have to believe in a particular religion to do that. And that's the work that I do now.
Beautiful. I'm so curious, fascinated already, Britt, on even in the book title, no belief required, or I think Steve used the term faith. Wondering if we could start with, shedding some light on some terms for us, like what's a recovering nihilist? What is faith anyway? Things like that.
Yeah, so faith, I mean, there's various definitions of it. The people on kind of the religious side of things like to say that everybody has faith, and atheists just have faith in science, right? But really, when we're talking about religious faith, we're talking about belief in the correct, unbelievable story. And for me, I want to bring spirituality into the 21st century. And spirituality, I define as connection to your deepest self and connection outside of self. For some, that includes a higher power. For me, that higher power is more like collective consciousness or the story of humanity, things that are a little bit less supernatural. And so for me, recovering from nihilism as an ism is just the belief that there's no inherent meaning in the universe, that the universe doesn't have a reason that you're here and that everything has a purpose and that kind of thing. For some people, that's immediately positive. Oh, there's no overarching meaning to the universe. I can create meaning, and then they're off and running. For me, that wasn't an intuitive move. For me, that was very depressing. That was very sad. That was very jarring to me psychologically. It was really hard to make sense of suffering. There were moments in that time where if there was a big red button that could destroy all human life on Earth, I felt like that would be the moral thing to do, that there's just too much suffering without enough meaning to justify this project of humanity. So for me, it was a deeply depressing place to be, and a place where I met kind of my existential fears, our fears of meaninglessness, our fears of death, our fears of isolation, our fears of freedom, that we're ultimately responsible for our own lives. And I didn't have tools to grapple with that because all the tools to deal with that were wrapped around religion, and I had left religion and I couldn't believe in it anymore. And that's where I see people get stuck when they're deconstructing, is if all your tools for the good life are wrapped around religion and you have religious trauma, you essentially can get stuck in that place. And so for me, the name of the game is, can I separate the tool that was there before the religion? Can we separate the tool that is helpful, that we actually have some science for, that is helpful for human well-being, from the dogmas and the vessel that has carried that tool? So what religion does, and this is where I think sometimes atheists get wrong, is sometimes atheists will say, well, all religion is just evil. That's all that it is. When really these stories have been the vessel for things that are good for humanity. Community, story, rituals, rites of passage. Some of these things secularism hasn't really replaced yet. And so the question becomes, how can we get these tools in a way that doesn't make us turn off our rationality, because that's part of us too? And how can we bring that conversation into the 21st century versus the 1st century or the 7th century?
Do you think secularism can do it? Or do you think to some extent we're not going to be able, I'm thinking of the psychological factors that you mentioned that sort of maybe gave rise from a social evolutionary perspective to the creation of religion. Like, are we going to be able to pull it off?
we're gonna jump right into my pessimism because for a lot of this, I can be optimistic. I think there's things that we can do. I think there's better mousetraps, and so I can speak really optimistically and give people a lot of hope. But since you jumped right to kind of the root of that, do I think that for something like secular humanism could create communities like Mormonism? The answer is no. I don't see any evidence that secularism, that the stories are sticky enough, that they're dogmatic enough. And religion has always had that upper hand. It creates more children. It creates more dogma. It creates more resources. People with the threat of hell are more willing to give up their time and their money and their resources towards this thing. And when we look even at colonialism in history, even though matriarchal societies or indigenous societies, we can look and say, actually, these people are scoring higher on human well-being across the board. The reality of history is that none of those societies survived colonialism. Colonialism just produces more dogma. Like when we get that culty part of our brain turned on, it's just going to be able to kick some butt because it can just produce more money, resources, children. It can control female reproduction and create more children and also create communities to raise those children. So in that sense, secularism may never win. There may never be something like secular humanism that's as big as the Catholic Church, where you could walk in and hear secular lessons on a Sunday in a church with a community and move and be able to join their local community and have secular humanist preschools. I don't think it's dogmatic enough to be able to produce that. So for me, my approach is not trying to change the world and create another religion, certainly not be the prophet of such a thing. I have no interest in that. My focus is, it seems to be that we are the particular kinds of primate that we are very culty, and that is, you have to actually uncult because it's kind of our natural state. We're very biased. We have all of these biases and dogma and religion and our surety of our subjective experience are so powerful that it takes a lot to undo that. And I think that's too much to ask of the world at large. But what we can do, I think, is individually create that. We can create that in my life, in my family life. I can create local communities. And I think it's going to be more of an individual game. There may always be a matrix, but I still think that there's a place in the wilderness where you can create your own kind of life and community, even if the world is always going to cult.
Yeah. So there are sort of greater social forces at play. So you're not necessarily focusing on sort of a broader social movement that's going to replace religion at large. It's more individual
and even
lives.
And even if there was like a movement, let's say there's a new person who's just like the perfect spiritual leader who's like really doing spirituality right. Within a few years, even that would turn into a cult. Like it's just what we do. It's what we did with Jesus. It's what we did with Buddha. We've seen these actual real mystic characters doing spirituality really beautifully, but it doesn't matter. Eventually, this is one of the reasons why nihilists often don't participate politically, because the new king the new political movement is just going to become the new king. And so there is some truth to that I think we can be aware of, but that I don't think that limits our ability individually to create lives of meaning, even if as a world, maybe we're always going to be drunk on some form of religion, political or otherwise.
Yeah, so when you're the little boy that points out that the emperor has no clothes, some people will be like, oh yeah, like I didn't see the clothes in the first place. And then others will double down like, no, he has clothes. So what do you do to help the folks? I'm going to torture this metaphor to death here, but like who see that the emperor has no clothes and they feel a bit unmoored and they're sort of spinning off into nihilistic space. How do you help them ground and find meaning again?
Yeah, a great place to start when you're really unanchored in that place is that our bodies are not, we don't choose a lot of things. So it can be very disorienting, for example, to learn that we don't have free will. That can be incredibly psychologically disorienting. It can even lead to a decrease in morality in some of the studies that we're seeing. But the good thing that we can lean into is that for whatever reason, this body has core values and has resonances and has preferences, and we can actually start there because those aren't decisions. And so one of the things that's hard in nihilism is it's really hard to make a decision, because what is up and down when you kind of believe that we're not even interacting with ultimate reality, if you get into kind of that world. And where we can start is, for whatever reason, this body that I'm in really loves conversations like this, like just genuinely enjoying this. If there's going to be a comment that's going to hit, I would just say, hey guys, do you want to keep talking? Because I'm just so enjoying in the moment this experience. And there's some things that this body doesn't particularly enjoy or just doesn't resonate with me. And so that can be somewhere where we can start. Where does your body connect? How do you connect to something that's bigger than you, whether that be a higher power or, in my case, kind of the story of humanity? Where do you connect? Where is life so meaningful that it doesn't matter that you're going to die because you're so enjoying the experience? What are the sandcastles that you enjoy building, even though the wave is going to come, because you're just in it like you were as a child, just enjoying it at the level of experience? And that's where we can start. So our body is actually a great place to start with that, because it can at least give us a direction, because we don't actually choose our core values. Our core values, for whatever reason, choose us. Maybe that's because we have a soul. Maybe that's because evolution wanted to scatter kind of traits and core values throughout the tribe for the survival of everyone. But for whatever reason, you don't have to start with nothing. There are some things that you resonate with and connect with more than others. And we can start to build your life towards that direction. And that at least gives you a path to start with.
There's something I'm noticing in your speech, and I wanted to check in with you to see if I'm sensing it accurately. And that's some humility, right? I'm hearing maybe and perhaps, and that's not what I was used to growing up in an organized religion. So I imagine that you believe the things that you believe and you have some confidence around your beliefs. But what would you say about sort of ontological or epistemic humility from a secular spiritualist perspective?
Yeah, so one of the misnomers about atheists is that they just have faith in science and they're sure that something came from nothing. I get this probably every day in a message on TikTok, that atheists just believe something incredible. They have faith that something came from nothing. And I, as a believer, don't have so much faith that I could believe in that. And to me, what atheism is about, and really the core of what atheism is atheism makes no positive statement about the universe. It doesn't make any positive claims about what is real. All it really says is, I've looked at the theistic God, not just deism. Deism is just a creator that doesn't interact with humans. But I've looked at the theistic God that has very specific ways of interacting with humans, with prayer, and you can eat this food on this day and all of that. I've looked at the arguments and I'm not convinced. That is actually all that atheism is. And so for me, atheism is not about, I'm sure there's no God and I've looked out into the universe and I'm sure that there's no God. It's really, for me, intellectual humility, that I've been studying history and religion long enough that I have to recognize that we as humans are bad at this game. So that was the shift for me. As I was in Christian seminary. I'm trying to make sense of things. I've believed multiple kind of belief systems around God, and eventually they would crumble. And so for me, the humility came by saying, I think that we're bad at this game. We keep building these gods. Thousands of gods are already died. We're not worshiping them anymore. There's around 400 kind of God belief systems that are on offer today. And I just kind of had to admit to myself that we are bad at this game of really trying to say, what is ultimate reality? What is God? How are we here? What is really going on at the root of things? What is God thinking? What does God think about this political question? And when we look across history, we are batting zero. Like, we are batting zero when we look back. When we look back, we always say we were wrong, always. And so for me, I just had this moment in seminary where I was like, I think we're the ones creating God rather than God creating us. And I didn't want that to be true. A lot of people think, oh, you're an atheist because you want to sin, or you wanted there to not be God, so you looked for that. No. I was looking for God, but had to admit that we're bad at this game. And so if we're bad at this game, let's set that aside. Are there tools that we can use regardless of what is actually true? We don't know enough about consciousness and how it relates to matter to really make definitive claims about what's going on in reality. I have some theories. I have some things that, like, I tend towards this way more than this way. But the beauty about the freedom about where I am now is, if I were to find out that there was a God, or if we were to find out the nature of consciousness and I was wrong, it's exciting to me because I don't have my identity wrapped around something being true. I just have these tools that are helpful for me, and I think everyone, and helpful for human being regardless of what is true. And then I can go into the truth conversation as a place to play, as a place to explore. And I can talk to other humans. What do you think is going on with reality? I don't know. What do you think? And those conversations are incredibly meaningful and fun for me. But when I used to have my identity wrapped around certain beliefs being true, then if I was wrong, it was devastating. It was, that's when you do faith crisis kind of things. So for me, I think the best approach is, what are the tools that help regardless of what is true, because we're bad at this game.
I'm curious how you landed on atheism at this existential kind of fork in the road versus agnosticism, for example. I think many people wrestle with that, and I'm just curious how that went for you.
Yeah, so technically those are two different questions when you're in kind of the field of philosophy. So atheism or theism is, are you convinced of a theistic God? And that's kind of one axis. And then agnosticism to Gnosticism is, how sure are you in your answer? How sure are you that we can even be asking this question? And so most really when someone says they're agnostic, really what they are, atheists, technically in a philosophical sense. They are atheists because they're not convinced of a theistic God. It's just a little bit in our conversations in culture, it tends to be that atheists are a little bit more militant, a little bit more willing to stick their neck out, and agnostics just kind of, it's almost like a soft atheism. Like, I'm not convinced, but I don't really want to talk about it. So that's kind of how it's ended up in culture. But really, agnostics are atheists in a technical sense. For me, the reason why I lean towards calling myself an atheist rather than leaning with the agnostic is, one, because I've thought about this a lot and spent my entire life asking and studying these questions. And so I'm a little bit more willing to stick my neck out and make a stance there. And the second reason is, I think for me, it's not that I look out in the universe and I'm sure that there's not a God. It's more so that I've studied human nature long enough, and studied cognitive biases, and studied existential fears, and studied religions, and studied gods, and how the God kind of matches the needs of the community at the time, that I think we have enough human information to say with some degree of confidence that I think we're the ones creating God. And even a Christian who's a believing Christian, when they look at the 200,000 years of human history before Christianity was a thing, I think even they can get there, that it seems to be that there are times that humans create these things because of their psychological and social needs. And so for me, that kind of, instead of just applying that to people other than my religion, I kind of just apply that across the board. I think we have enough information about humans to say that I think we're the ones doing this. What's next?
Well, I'm curious.
This is great.
No, this is really fun, and thank you for humoring all these deep questions and these great thoughtful answers. I'm wondering about the link between a question I've sat with for a while, the link between nihilism and hopelessness, suicidality. Like, is there one? Is one debate, and what do you think about that nihilistic place that many, if not everyone, in a flicker of a moment ends in sometimes?
Yeah, so I do think that there's evidence that fundamentalism is more dangerous for others, meaning it's more violent on other in the sense of religious crusades and that kind of thing. And that's pretty strong evidence. Nihilists don't gather and cause problems in the ways that religions or political religions do in any kind of fundamentalism. But we also have strong evidence that nihilism is more self-damaging. And there is a link between suicidality and nihilism. And we're seeing some of that with Gen Z as well, which was the focus in my master's degree, was Gen Z and the future of American religion. So what I think nihilism is doing is we have these deep psychological fears, and I think we all do. I didn't realize how much I was being driven by my fears. I don't have to tell you guys that for most of my life, I felt like I had rational reasons for everything, when really I had emotional reasons or fears or triggers or wounds that were happening at a base level, and I was simply applying rationality on top of that. And so I think what's happening with nihilism is we have these deep existential fears. There's 4 that I really go into from the work of Irvin Yalom, who really dove in. He's a psychotherapist who dove into existential fears. And we have a fear of meaninglessness, and we have some pretty strong data on that, and which is why we want to create things like legacy and have children, and we want our lives to be meaningful. We build statues so that we can hold on to this idea that our life mattered. We have a fear of death. And when we look into terror management studies, like, it's shocking how much our behavior is driven by this on the brim of our consciousness, fear of death. We have a fear of isolation, of being alone, that nobody really on this earth, or there's no God that knows exactly what it's like to be me. And that's so lonely and isolating and scary. And then also a fear of freedom, that there's actually no guru that can give me the 12 steps to my perfect life. I actually have to figure that out. And that's really terrifying too. We like to think that humans love freedom, but when we have too many choices, actually we're quite paralyzed. We don't deal with that well psychologically. So religion has always been a security blanket against these existential monsters. Always. We've always had ways to deal with these fears. And the rise of religion may even be linked with the time when we got smart enough to realize that we were going to die. That's when we start burying people with things that would be valuable to the living, but we start burying them with the dead. So for me, nihilism is this feeling of being naked to these existential fears and monsters, when before you had all these thought-ending cliches and these kind of buttresses against all of these monsters. And the reality is that this generation that's kind of facing nihilism as they're deconstructing from religion, or there's a meaning crisis with Gen Z, and we're seeing suicidality and anxiety and depression. I think it's because this may be the first time in human history where you're dealing with these monsters directly with the least amount of resources, without a community, without a story, without really anything. And we're psychologically not built to handle that. We've never had to handle that. And the tools between a 16-year-old thinking about these things and the, philosophy from Nietzsche that may help him is quite a big gap. And we're losing a lot of kids kind of in that gap of need. So the benefit, though, of facing these fears that have scared us our entire human history, and that we've created stories in order to kind of keep at bay, is that these monsters force you to a place of deep honesty about what a life worth living just for the experience looks like for you. It forces that, because your ego or your reputation or what other people think of you, all of that falls away, because, you know, you're going to die and the universe doesn't care. Like, so all of those things can fall away. And at that moment, that rock bottom moment, that dark night of the soul moment, you can actually get honest about what a life worth living looks like and be brave enough to take risks into that direction. And that's why Nietzsche says that eventually you can throw a rose into the abyss to thank the monsters for not swallowing you whole. And I think the reason that he said that is because if you face those monsters, if you can gather some tools to face those monsters, it forces you to live a life that's worth living at the level of experience in a way that you never could have before facing those monsters. And that's been true for me, and true with the other people that I see and talk to who have faced nihilism and lived to tell the tale.
I love that Rose quote, because it does really sum up poetically the fact that at this rock bottom place, there's really nowhere left to fall. And I think the risks there come from other places in our nakedness and in the darkness, like you alluded to, of like the things we look at when in our profession we study suicide and of course work very hard with people to try and prevent it, is you know, their perceived burdensomeness, or their like you mentioned, that hopelessness, aloneness, and lack of tools and other things that can come up and be extra frightening without those safety nets, silver linings of kind of religious narrative or a safety blanket down there.
I wanted to piggyback though on you know, Reid asking about nihilism. Can you talk to us a bit about the difference, if there is one, between nihilism and absurdism? You and I, before we hit record, we're talking a bit about that movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, and the rock and the googly eyes scene. So yeah, tell us a bit about absurdism.
Yeah, it's a really subtle difference. I think a lot of it just comes with your personality, but so nihilism is just the belief that there's no inherent meaning in the universe. It can be positive or negative. For me, I experience that as negative. Other people's experience that as very positive. So an optimistic nihilist says, great, there's no meaning in the universe. I can live my life. I can create experiences that are meaningful to me, and I'm off and running. An absurdist has a little bit more of a rebellious take. I tend to think that if you have a rebellious nature, you're a little bit more on board with absurdism. But absurdism essentially says there's something fundamentally absurd about this idea that we are born with this desire for meaning and purpose, and the universe says, I don't give a shit. That is like such a strange situation that we find ourselves in, that we seek for something like eternal justice, or we seek for meaning, or we seek for everlasting life, and the universe literally couldn't care less. And there's something just absurd about that difference. And so for Camus, it was really about, I'm going to create meaning and purpose and create justice in the world and create morality in the world, because fuck you, universe, that you don't care. I'm going to care. I'm going to do it anyway. Even though, yeah, it's an act of rebellion, that even though the sun is going to blow up and there's going to be no record of any of this, and everything that you do is ultimately meaningless, I'm going to create meaning anyway, because maybe there should have been. Maybe someone should have. Maybe this should have mattered. So there's a little bit just more of a rebellion that you're trying to bridge that gap between the way that we are, which is we want justice, we want morality, we want things to be fair. We're born as babies, and you can correct me on the data on this, but babies, I think as early as 9 months old, can actually show signs of that was unfair when they kind of do these little puppet scenes, you know, in front of a baby. And so we're born with this sense of morality and fairness, and our life should have meaning and we should live forever. And how are we born that way when it just seems like the universe just is so indifferent to our little corner of our solar system. And so really it's this kind of rebellious way of living that I'm going to create it anyway, even though the universe doesn't care. So you eventually kind of end up in the same place where you're creating meaning. But for someone like Camus, who was an absurdist, the symbol for him is above my head here. It's Sisyphus who's pushing the rock up the hill. And it's this character in Greek mythology who has to push a rock up the hill, and then it falls down to the other side, and he does this forever. And so it is ultimately meaningless. And Camus has this great quote that says, one must imagine Sisyphus happy, because when we're actually in the push, in the climb of what we're doing, we can still actually find meaning and joy, even though it's ultimately meaningless. And so the question then becomes, what is the meaningful rock that you want to push up the hill? Not because the universe cared, but because you find yourself happier in the journey of it. And so for me, secular spirituality is not so much about changing the world and we're going to change things, and we're going to change human nature, and I'm going to become some prophet of something. And it's going to be ultimately meaningful. For me, this is, even if I fail, even if religion and fundamentalism win and they destroy the world or whatever they're going to do, even if everything that I do is meaningless because 10 years from now, a solar flare happens and we're done, I still would want to do this, because the journey itself, the conversation itself, the exploration itself is meaningful to me. So there's the differences there are subtle, but it can be healthy for nihilists who are in pessimistic nihilism to either move into optimistic nihilism or absurdism as a way to find joy again.
I think, Britt, what you're talking about here is perhaps one of the most perilous places to be for somebody who's deconstructing, but also is pregnant with promise. I know that, like, for me, shifting, I'm still on my path here, but shifting my meaning source from the afterlife or from getting it right so that I make sure I'm in alignment with what God wants, to building, as you say, building sandcastles just for the sake of building the sandcastle because it's something you want to do, has been difficult to do. You've talked a bit earlier in our conversation about the body and maybe what one might call intuition, and learning to trust what the desires that emerge from you and giving them veracity because they come from you, and you don't need any other sort of external validation that what you desire, what you want to create, the meaning that you construct is good in and of itself. How do you help people who are trying to make that shift? Because I imagine that it's, there's a lot of the people that you try to help, a lot of your clients are struggling with that transition.
Yeah, it's really hard because each person is so individual. It's like trying to force someone to have an awakening, like in Eckhart Tolle. It's like, it's something that happens to people, but because there's more going on in our subconscious than our conscious mind is ever aware of. There's so much more to us happening in our body and in our subconscious than we can ever shine the light of our attention to. It's really hard to kind of find that door that people are needing. And so a lot of it starts with that connection piece that I talked about earlier. And there's a study that I use called the Tree of Contemplative Practices. It's the largest study done where we actually figure out how people move into that space of beingness and connection, and all the options that we have for humans to do that. And so sometimes that's helpful for people where they realize something that they've already been doing or an experience that they've had. They're going to resonate with some things on that list more than others. So we can start there. But for the sake of this podcast, probably the quickest route to dropping your ego self, dropping your kind of default mode of your brain and seeing what's going on in your subconscious is to use psychedelics. So even though I can talk about recovery from nihilism, I can talk about all the tools that I've used, I can talk about Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn and all these Camus and Nietzsche and all these thinkers, the reality is at the level of my brain, one of the most helpful tools I had was in this place to do a psychedelic journey with psilocybin. And I don't do that regularly anymore. And that's just kind of, for me, where I'm at with my psychedelics journey. I've done maybe 6 or 7, and no longer feel a need. The last couple I had just felt like wasn't kind of worth the time and the how hard it is on your body. And I've gotten better at finding ways to tap into my intuition. I've gotten better at dream work. I've gotten better at some other things where I don't, it's not a tool that I'm currently needing right now. But at the time, it was incredibly impactful because it showed me in my thought loops that I was stuck in my nihilism that I was stuck in. It gave me a glimpse that there was a different way to be, where I felt like a little kid again, where I was just curious in all directions. And it was just so fun to be alive. It was just so magical to be in my body. And oh my God, there's a bird. And look at how that fire is dancing. And it was magic again, the magic of reality. And I had lost that in my nihilism journey. So sometimes the quickest way is just to give you some mushrooms, because something will happen, and at least show you and open that door that there's a different way to be. There's different ground to stand on than the one that you're actually standing in. And then we can find ways, how can we get there with your sober mind, with your waking mind, so that we know we don't have to become dependent on the drugs to be in that state. And that tends to be my approach to psychedelics. How can we use it to open doors to different ways of being that our conscious mind may not be able to just jump into on its own? And then once we open that door, how can we attain that? For some people, it's really through their body. For some people, it's really through quiet time and meditation and breath work. For some people, it's nature. For some people, it's the awe that they feel when they're in conversation with other humans. And so girls' lunches, and being able to talk about life is their spiritual water. For some people, it's service. For some people, it's art, and the art that just flows through them that gets them into that flow state. But once we open that door, now the question becomes, how can we keep that door open so that you're in that state all the time without the drugs? Because anywhere you can get with psychedelics, you're capable to get to without it. It just sometimes is the most helpful thing for opening that door, and also allowing you to have different thoughts, get out of your thought loops that you can get in when you're in nihilism, and at least give you an opportunity to see things from another perspective.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you called those philosophers thinkers, right? This is what you're describing is a hard place to think your way to. It's maybe more powerful and maybe easier to feel your way to it, to experience your way to it. And psychedelics, as you beautifully described, are a powerful tool to do that thing. But sometimes, like when you get the message, it's time to hang up the phone. It's not necessary to keep going back if you haven't properly or thoroughly or in a way that has been helpful to you integrated the experience. But I can imagine some folks who are deep in the throes of nihilism or absurdism and confronting those existential fears will have a psychedelic experience, and it sort of plugs them back into spirituality of a sort. Some people find their way back to God, right? I've certainly had that experience with some of my clients, and but kind of like you described, some people just find their way back to the grand mystery and have a reverence and awe for it, and that's anchoring enough.
Yeah, I think there was a study that showed that 2/3 of atheists who do, I think it was more of a hero's dose of psilocybin, no longer self-reported as atheists after the experience. And that doesn't mean that they jumped into religion. Like I had this experience and now I'm a Mormon again. That doesn't seem to happen. It's more so that like you said, it just opens you up to the magic of reality and how mysterious reality is. And the really cool thing about being on this side of things is reality, whatever's going on at the root level of reality, and how little we know about it, and how mysterious it is, and how there's so many things that are going on in the world or in my body or experiences that I had that I can't explain. It's that the magic and mystery of reality are even more magical and mysterious than even our stories about reality. And we have some, I mean, like you talk to a Mormon about the plan of salvation, and that's a whole mysterious game. But the actual whatever is going on with reality is even more magical and mysterious than our stories about it. And that's when life really changes. That, oh my God, we are flying through space in these meat suits. And sometimes when you talk, my body resonates and it buzzes because it likes what you're saying. How does it even do that? And then I'm in the car, and then there's these sound waves. And sometimes these sound waves make me want to turn up the music and move my body in these really interesting, weird ways. And there's something about the magic of existence itself that we can miss when we're in nihilism, specifically if you're a headspace person, which I am, where you're just stuck in your thought loops about what is ultimately real, and I'm never going to know it. We're never going to know anything, and everything is just stupid and blah, blah, blah. And you can miss if you can't get into your body, if you can't get into something else, which was really hard for me. And I hated that I had to admit that there were limits to my conscious mind and to my rationality, because that felt scary to me. But once I got into my body and how mysterious and magical it is to be alive and connected to everything around me, that's when it's just so beautiful just to be alive. The purpose of life is just to be alive. And you can miss that if you're in a headspace trying to think yourself there. I don't think you can get there purely by thinking yourself. That doesn't mean we turn off our rationality. We never turn it off. It always has a seat at the table. We can use terms to try to describe these experiences or make sense of these experiences or talk about these experiences. We can keep them grounded in what we know about neuroscience. But we are not just rational robots that can think ourselves to this kind of experience way of living. There's more to us than that. Reid, I think you had something there. Sorry.
Oh, no, this is fascinating. I'm just wondering, before we hit record, we were talking about the word numinous and how it's a cool word, and an experience of the numinous, and it's spelled different than Numinus, the organization, but of course the organizational name comes from the mystical term. I'm wondering how you see atheists viewing the mystical experience or the role of it. Like secular. We were talking about secular humanism, and most people would define secular as just without religion. Some people take it further and would say without spirituality. I don't really agree with that, but I wanted to just get on the same page with definitions and also hear maybe an atheist perspective on the mystical.
Yeah, like I said, with that study with the 2/3 of atheists who don't self-identify as atheist afterwards, it's not because they go back to a belief in a Santa Claus God. That seems to never really come back. It's really that we're so interconnected in ways that we don't understand. Quantum entanglement, experiences people have on mushrooms, how connected we are at the ground level, that it leaves open. They just come away from that experience having more openness to what is than just kind of your atheist stance of, like, let's be honest, in society, being an atheist can often be getting on your high horse about how much you're smarter than religious people. That can be really an aspect of what being an atheist in society is. And the reason that some people then have a hard time identifying as atheists afterwards, they essentially put nothing because there's nothing on this list that even that they feel like applies to them. And so they write something in because there's just no words to describe where they are. It's that I don't think it's this Iron Age God or these Iron Age gods, but there's something really magical and interesting and mysterious happening here that I'm more open to now after having had these mystical experiences. And so I think atheists in that, mystical atheists, or sometimes it's called rational mysticism, or these kinds of types, I think it's more of just an openness to, we are far more connected to each other than we can understand. And just openness to exploring the mystery of what that is, rather than just getting stuck in wrapping your identity around, I'm an atheist, I'm sure there's not a God, and I'm smarter than religious people, and religious people are stupid. That's what's going on in the society, around the term atheist. But they, you give them a hero's dose of mushrooms, and all of a sudden they're just really open to the mystery. And that's what mystics have called God for the longest time, that God is just a word that we're just putting on the mystery. And that's when spirituality can come back. Because if religion, is just these set of dogmas and set of rules that we can't rationally support anymore, mysticism is this different thing entirely. Mysticism, in contrast to religion, is a focus on the experience of what people have called God. Not, this is God, this is what you do, this is what God thinks, blah, blah, blah. That's religion. Mysticism has always been, I don't care what you call the thing. These are just mouth sounds. This is my mouth sound trying to explain an experience that you've had, and you have your mouth sounds to try to explain it too. The sounds don't matter. What matters is, have you experienced this? And this is what mysticism is. And there's a mystic kind of, it's like an underground river of each religion. Each religion kind of has its form of mysticism. And in many ways, mysticism starts religions, and then religions become the clubhouses that they are. But this is when you'll see atheists start to be curious about religion again, because they'll be able to separate. There's something mystical and interesting that was underneath all the things that religion kind of put on top of that. And that's when I can see even atheists like myself become mystics, and even be able to sit with other religious mystics, no matter what religion they kind of are grounded in. There's this quote that says, religions quarrel, but mystics speak the same language. And I really have found that to be true.
Yeah, I love that. And Steve and I talk a lot about like adult development on here. And it seems that through the hero's journey of kind of shedding religion and finding your own kind of spirituality, if you will, without the same belief or faith. Seems like there's a phase of that, getting fired up about it, being anti, or needing to understandably heal the parts of you that need some tender loving care. But then that end goal of being able to sit around the fire together and converse, and not have those trigger buttons pushed by the first conversation about religion, I think is a beautiful thing to aspire to. There's one other related quote I encountered that I'm wondering what you think of. Sometimes I'll hear a quote and clip it and just sit with it because it puzzles me. And this one's from, I think, some Lakota writings under this a book or concept called Mitakwe Owasin. Means like we are all related. But this passage says, if you undertake a spiritual journey and you do not become an atheist at the end of the journey, you did not do it correctly. And it's kind of a thought-provoking one, but wondering what that brings up for both of you.
Steve, you want to take a crack at it?
Well, it is true of my personal experience. Not that I would, I guess I'll leave it there. Like that, I took religion very, very seriously growing up. And I remember telling my mom when I was sort of in the throes of my so-called crisis of faith, if you took religion, if by you, not my mom, but generally, if human beings took religion as seriously as I do, you'd have the same concerns. And so I felt like where I have landed is it just is for me the most honest place to be. And that's why I was talking about epistemic humility earlier, and what impresses me about you, Britt, and the way you approach these difficult questions. That I think it just feels more honest for me, true to my experience of the world, to simply be in awe of what we're calling sort of the great mystery, and not feel any pressure to inject any dogma into that, right? I don't have to assert a belief in anything that I don't feel confident is true. I can sit with the existential voids, not that they're comfortable, but I can sit with them because, like you were saying before, it's enough for me to make a sandcastle that I enjoy making. And so I can appreciate that other people who go on that journey maybe don't land there. So I don't know if I agree with the quote wholesale, but I think it's true from my experience.
Yeah, for me, what that brings up is this idea that Socrates and others that we see as having great wisdom are the ones who admit that I know nothing, like that we don't know just vastly more than anything that we think that we know. And the things that we think that we know are also probably wrong at some fundamental level. And so if you're going into religion to confirm, I think it's Christopher Hitchens who says something like that isn't it interesting that these people who study religion or go into Christian school, they find out that they were born in the correct religion and that they were right the whole time. And if you're going into religion and you come out with the idea that I was born with the correct of all the millions of humans who have had differing views on what's going on here, if you go to school or if you do religion in a way that says I was right the whole time, I was born into the correct not only was I born into kind of the correct way to see things, but my lens inside that is the most correct of the most correct, tribe, of religion or of God. And if you go into religion and have that conclusion, then that's just ego and biases that are just looking for ways to confirm how great and special and smart you are. And that's just an ego game. That's all that is. And so if your spirituality doesn't have you shed your ego, if your spirituality doesn't have some ego deaths, if your spirituality doesn't allow you to let go of your identity or to make peace with how much you don't know instead of all the things that you were right about, then it's just an ego game. And so for me, I started this doctorate program in theology to try to figure out what's going on with reality. And the reason that I didn't finish it and that I'm at all but dissertation is because I told my professor at the end, when I started this, I had some ideas about what is true about God and reality and religion. And here at the end of my journey, when it's time to write my dissertation is going to be, I know nothing, period. And I don't think that that's going to pass. And so I left it because I felt like I didn't have anything to write. I didn't have anything in that world to say because I had lost all my beliefs. I had lost all my identity. I had lost my community. I had lost my sense of self. I had lost everything. But maybe that was the point. Maybe that was the maybe that was the true inner work. And so I have a degree in, a master's degree, but really it was a process of unlearning rather than a process of I'm really learning what's going on here with God and ultimate reality. So for me, that also rings true. I think that's it. I've never heard that quote before. It's really beautiful.
So Britt, you talking about ego death and Reid bringing up the hero's journey reminded me of something that I wanted to get your take on before we finish. And that is the differences between sort of so-called masculine and feminine spirituality, or patriarchal and matriarchal, even societies or approaches to spirituality. Because I think I've heard you say, this might have been in a webinar that my wife and I listened to that you did, that the concept of ego death and sort of letting your dissolving sense of self on a path to enlightenment is more sort of typical of masculine approaches to spirituality and enlightenment. So correct me if I got that wrong, but I'd love to hear you riff on this for a bit.
Yeah, this is one of my soapboxes, just in a more recent journey for me. But what happens with a lot of women who are leaving religion is they'll step into the world of spirituality and encounter male gurus who have spent time in India and gone on retreat and have some things to say. And a lot of that world is about either killing the ego or having an ego death or transcending the ego. And this tends to be helpful for men who have an overdeveloped sense of ego. So the 50-year-old CEOs who are having a midlife crisis, who then go to India and go on retreat. That may be the best thing for you, to have an ego death and realize that everything that you think you are is a bit of an illusion that you're doing because of your insecurity, and to just break that open. And it allows you these men to come back and be more human and be more vulnerable and that sort of thing. The difference for women is that women in patriarchy, whether it be in religion or just society in general, often never fully develop a healthy ego in the first place. And so they're leaving religion, or they're going to these male gurus. And I have hundreds of messages of women for years who were trying to kill or transcend the ego, and it wasn't working for them. They weren't having these great experiences. In fact, they felt like shit afterwards. And I think the reason is we have our ego is a part of us. It's there to protect us. It's not an evil part of us. And what we're all trying to get to is a sense of balance, that you can put on your ego like we do clothing, that like even to get on today, I'm a Britt Hartley. That's my name. These are my preferences. You put on your clothing so we can interact in the world. But the healthy thing that you can do with your ego is at any time, I can take that ego off, just like clothing, and just really relate just nakedly human to human with another person. And that tends to be a healthy way to deal with ego. And so for men who have an overdeveloped sense of ego death and ego dissolution can be really healthy to get them to that place. If you're a woman and had either, let's say, a narcissistic parent, you were raised in a patriarchal society, you were raised in patriarchal religion, you actually probably never finished developing an ego in the way that men do. So you actually may not even know who you are. And so you're trying to kill something that hasn't even developed and trying to get the benefit from it. And so one of the things that I talk about a lot is that in the spiritual space, you don't get a lot of, especially the male guru types, saying that sometimes the most spiritual thing that you can do is to build an ego. And so I give permission to women that, hey, you never got to finish growing up. Let's date yourself for a while. What are your preferences? What do you like to do? How do you take up space? What does your voice have to say? And for many women, they don't know. They have no idea. So ego dissolution is not the tool for them. They have too little and essentially have to build that up. But what male spiritual guru has ever said, like, hey guys, let's work on building up your voice and let's walk into a room with a little bit more power, with a little bit of more self-respect. Let's demand some attention. That's never talked about in the spiritual world, because women don't write scripture in religion, and they also aren't the main voice in spirituality outside of religion. And so in that way, women can often feel, I'm not spiritual because I don't meditate, because I haven't had these ego dissolving experiences, because I have young children. And so I don't have the time to fly to Costa Rica and do ayahuasca. Like, I'm just not spiritual. I have 9 times out of 10, when I ask women what their spiritual practice is, they say that I don't have one. And so one of the messages that is really important to me is that feminine spirituality historically has always been about embodied spirituality, meaning it's in your life. It's not something you do. It's not this masculine, action-oriented, you go and do the cold plunge and then you go on retreat and you do it alone and you sit on the side of the mountain. Women don't have that life. They don't have anything like that life. And so there was this TikTok I stitched that went viral a year ago, where a woman was talking about, at the beginning preface of all the ice bath bros is this thing that says, I'd like to thank my wife for running the house and taking care of the kids so that I could go to Bali and learn these things and come back and tell you about it. And so the women have always been the women are like, wait, I want to hear that lady's life. Like, your life doesn't match mine. Women wake up and adjust to the people around them because they tend to be more relational. And when I say feminine and masculine here, I'm not talking about genitalia. My father has much more feminine characteristics. My mother has much more masculine. It's just kind of how we've divided this action-oriented kind of masculine traits, we've just called these masculine. But feminine spirituality, that feminine side of things that we all are because we're both, has always been spirituality on the go. And so what I try to tell women is that if you wake up in the middle of the night and you're cleaning up shit off the floor and with a screaming child and you want to go to bed, that is shadow work and that is ego work. Are you kidding me? Like a man can go to India and think about loving and serving others and feel like he's enlightened. But the woman who is actually so sleep deprived and her brain is insane, like her brain is crazy, and she still shows up to show love to that child and clean up vomit off of the floor. And we're not calling that spiritual. We're not calling that ego work. We're not calling that anything. We just call that women's work. Like that's not fair. That's not what's happening. And so women, when you actually look at your life, a lot of times female spirituality, it's the relationships and the emotional labor that they do in relationships. It's the shadow work that they do as mothers when they meet the worst part of themselves as mothers, is when you meet the worst part of yourself. The hardest shadow work I did was when I was a young mother and had violent thoughts around my children and had to face that side of me that I didn't even know was there, because I was like, oh, I'm a pacifist. That's not me. My brain had other things in mind during that time. So women are far more, I think, spiritual than we realize. Because women have never had the microphone, we haven't called all the things that they do embodied in their life on the go spirituality, because men have been the ones who have defined what spirituality is. And men have a lot more privilege to be able to go off and do things on their own individually, have a schedule, do their breath meditation, whatever they're doing. And so we've called that spirituality, and we haven't called what women do spiritual, when sometimes it's just as hard or meaningful work, and sometimes even a lot harder, and we're just not valuing it. So that was a big rant. Oh yeah. But one of my favorites.
One of mine too. That really resonates. Thank you for sharing that. Having a mother, having daughters, and seeing what mothers do as way too much of a thankless but extremely noble and meaningful thing. It's just the world has treated women unfair for far too long. And working with a lot of women in the mental health sphere, I'm the medical director of an eating disorder center. I came across this lady's work named Neva Piran in Canada, and she wrote a textbook on embodiment and rating scale. But I bring it up because it seems to line up with what you're describing really well. She describes these 3 domains of embodiment, of like physical and mental and social. And this assessment will look at where an individual is at in a number of different domains, like positive connection with body, agency and expression in the world, using your voice, experiencing joy and sexual desires, and in self-care and attunement, and countering objectification. But one thing that's interesting is her book, on the cover, there's this corset, and each of these domains would be like a hook of the corset, and through the work of returning home to your body and reclaiming your embodied spirituality, you're unhooking one of the hooks with each of these domains. And so, I bring that up as another like framework I've used to start to get at things like that.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I think for a long time, even probably a decade after leaving Mormonism, I still felt like, how can I call myself a spiritual director? Because I actually never find the time to do long meditations, and I should be. It was still a list of shoulds. In order to call yourself spiritual, there's this list of shoulds. And when I finally had some female voices that counteracted that showed me, like in the book, all the things that you're doing that you're not even realizing that you're doing that are spiritual, I was finally able to let go of the shoulds and have spirituality just be embedded in my life. And so if you look at my day, you may think I'm just a basic white girl, basic white mom. but spirituality is embedded in every moment of my life. So when I wake up, I don't do yoga. I don't do a long meditation. I say memento mori. That's just my little phrase that just focuses on how I want to be spending my day. The most consistent meditation that I do is the 1 minute that I before my kids get off the bus, where I'm in my car, and I take a minute to just check myself and get in a good place so that I can receive the onslaught of feelings that I'm going to get from my children and be present for that. It's a 2 minute, just breathing in a quiet car. And I'm awake when I'm doing the dishes and creating a meal for my family to create these moments. And I'm spiritual when I'm thinking about my daughter and her birthday party and how I can make her feel seen and special, and all of the logistics that go into that. That there is no difference between the spiritual list of things that I do that make me a spiritual person that I can put on Instagram. There's actually no difference between that, between spirituality and my life. I'm just awake in my life. And that is what the female side of the conversation gives you, that it's not a list of to-dos. You don't have to go onto a mountain and dissolve your ego. You can, if that's what calls for you and you have the privilege to be able to do that. But spirituality can be so embedded in your life that there's just no difference between your spiritual life and your life. And that's when I felt like, as a woman, I really became free, when I let go of the shoulds. And that didn't happen until a decade after leaving a patriarchal religion. So it tends to be a long journey of unpacking for women, but this isn't just for women. The beautiful thing about the divine feminine in our stories is, unlike the Old Testament God, she's not a jealous God. She wants everyone to be able to live an embodied life that's unique and personal to them. And so I think it's an invitation for all, gender expressions. But that's what we get from the female side of the conversation.
That's beautiful. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for going there, Britt. We just have a few more minutes. I have a semi-related question to what we just finished discussing. This is just a curiosity of mine based on some observations I've made, but I've noticed that a lot of women, that, like, especially here in Utah, when they deconstruct from Mormonism in particular, they often find sort of refuge in the occult. I know you talk about the occult a little bit in your book, and you mentioned astrology earlier. Do you observe the same thing or something completely different? And if so, what do you make of that particular curiosity and that shift or that pattern?
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that movement, and it's definitely bigger than Mormonism, but especially Christianity in America, that if you're deconstructing from Christianity in America as a woman, there's essentially a direct pipeline to witchcraft and paganism and the occult and some of these things. Now, the positive thing is that because Christianity and patriarchal religion really shuts down your inner voice, especially as a woman, these places are where the best part of what the occult can do, your tarot and your astrology and your crystals and these things, is that it can get you in touch with your inner voice and your intuition. That's the best of what they can do, is that they can help navigate a conversation between your conscious and subconscious mind. That's what it does best. In relation to religion, that often tries to shut that down. So for women, it's often kind of a way that they find their inner voice and find out really who they are, is by flipping a tarot card and asking a question and just seeing what the subconscious pops into the conscious mind, because the subconscious can relate to symbols a lot better than language. And I think that all of that can be healthy and can be healing and can help you find yourself and your inner voice and your intuition and check in on yourself. The thing that I'm concerned with, because everything has a shadow, is that unchecked intuition essentially becomes your own ego. Or it can, because you have no one to check it. You don't have mentors, you don't have anything. And so what can happen if you go too quickly into this world without fully deconstructing is you essentially make a religion out of astrology. And so the thing that bugs me, and this is my personal pet peeve, is that Mormons, for example, Mormon women will say, oh, Mormonism isn't true, and Joseph just had this seer stone, and he's a treasure digger, and he put a rock in a hat, and that's so stupid. And then literally a week from then, they're telling me that their crystals are charging in the moonlight and doing all these magical things for them. And it's like, you just jumped from one rock to another. Like, I'm not sure what you really deconstructed here. Like, you just jumped from Joseph Smith's rock to New Age's rock. And I'm really not sure why you think you have some kind of intellectual high ground by doing that. And the same thing for near-death experiences. Like, near-death experience, science is very fascinating. But if you jump straight from religion into near-death experiences and past life work, you're essentially just giving your brain a new thing that can help you hide from death. And that's really what it's doing. And so my fear about jumping into the occult world is that if you haven't actually deconstructed fully the parts of your brain that were formed in religion, like looking for a prophet, like wanting to be special, like trying to avoid death, all of these things are just going to show up in the occult world, and there's nobody going to be there to check you. So you'll just get totally lost in your own beliefs about frequencies and energies. And I was Cleopatra in a past life. And all of a sudden, the things that you're saying are even more unsubstantiated than Mormonism. But nobody's going to, in New Age, nobody's going to tell you that you're wrong, because it's kind of really the new religion. So my advice to women who are going into that world is to use it as a tool. But like we said earlier, have some intellectual humility about the truth claims in this space. And also just really focus on how you're using it as a tool for inner work. Because if you're not, it's just going to become the new place for your brain to create a religion. And we know from cult studies that the time you're most at risk for joining a cult is when you have just left another cult, because your brain is looking for something to plug in to the pattern system that it already has. That's the easiest move for a brain to do. If you're not aware that your brain is trying to do that, you're probably jumping into the space trying to find religious replacements. You're going to find a new prophet. You're going to find new magic, that you're going to find new ways to make yourself special. You're going to find new ways to avoid death. You're going to find new ways to feel like you're predicting and controlling the future rather than making peace with uncertainty. And essentially, I'm seeing a lot of women create it as their new religion, but now without a check. Because at least with Mormonism, you'll get some mysticism, or Christianity, you'll get some mysticism once in a while, or you'll find a writer or a speaker who can check you, because, there's at least other voices that you're having to challenge your own beliefs. But in New Age, where it's all your own intuition, if you don't have that check at all, you can essentially create the religion of your own ego and not know that you're doing it. And that's my fear for that space.
Thank you for going there. We got to wrap up. Britt, I'm so thankful for the work that you've done. Like I've said before, I've been a consumer of your TikToks for a long time, and now I've thoroughly enjoyed your book. So folks, pick up Britt's book, No Nonsense Spirituality, All the Tools, No Faith Required. Just really appreciate your boldness. I can imagine there are some people, if they've made it to the end of this episode and they've felt triggered or frustrated, they've been hate listening or whatever. Thank you for listening to the whole thing. I can also imagine there are people for whom this has been a life-changing message now that they've found you and the work that you're doing. So thanks for choosing to build this particular sandcastle with us.
My pleasure, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Britt. I love these deep, deep questions that make us sit in uncomfortable places and think about truth and what life is really about.
Thank you. And I wish we had more time. I know you have a client literally like right now, but I wish we had more time so that I could hear some of your thoughts on all these things. But the time was what it was. But thank you for listening and reaching out. I enjoyed it. Well,
let's have you on again. I think that'd be fun.
Yeah, I do wanted the question that I would ask you, if you might have to hop off there, Steve, but I'm still trying to understand why Mormons go into mushrooms at such a larger rate than Christians post deconstruction. And I would love to get your thoughts on that side of the conversation. That was the thing that I want to talk to get you guys about. But I think you have a client. We might have to do that another time.
Yeah, let's sit with that one. Maybe even encourage our listeners to think about that and share some thoughts. I was literally thinking about that a lot yesterday for, I don't know why, but and when you were talking about kind of women in the occult, I wanted to ask, how do men react to their post-religious life, and what do they get attracted to, and is that one of them, and for what reasons?
Yeah, those are good questions to dive into. Do you have to go, Steve? Do you want to hang out for a second?
Why don't you go ahead and answer Reid's question?
Okay.
I'm actually going to go to the bathroom, so I'll be right back. But
I tend to think that men don't usually go into the occult space. It's a very female heavy space, and they're just kind of, the woo-ness of it just tends to not resonate with them. And so I see men more go into into body spaces where they want to get a better sense of health in their body. I see that. I see wellness as kind of the religion that often men flock to. So unhealthily, that would look like if you used to repent in order to feel like you're on top of it, now you do detoxes. If you used to, like, it was good to have mutual on Wednesday and church on Sunday to have a schedule, now you have a workout schedule. And before it was like cheating death by having the right baptism. Well, I'm cheating death by making sure that I'm drinking wheatgrass so that I live longer than everybody else, or whatever it is. So I see men do that kind of plug in with the wellness religion. I see that a lot more common. But often men are a lot more lost than women. Because men can get stuck in their headspace, and that was much more familiar to me too. I think that men get more stuck in general, because if you're just in your headspace and you don't have kind of the social life that women do, or the connection to body that sometimes women do, then I think that men can get more stuck in general than women, who sometimes find it a little easier to just pay attention to their body and start moving in that direction. So a lot of times then men go the psychedelics route, and sometimes have to be on that all the time. And I have to kind of try to wean men off of that and show them how to do that in their life rather than through psychedelics. I see that a lot more often.
Yeah, and they certainly seem to be seeking those, or more at risk of seeking those as an escape, perhaps. But when you were describing kind of men and the wellness industry, it made me think of this idea I read once, that absurdism is just like a nihilistic worldview with stoic tendencies, perhaps. I know it's debatable and doesn't capture it all, but it may speak to some of that phenomenon, perhaps.
Yeah, I do. I did a TikTok a while ago about why there's no women in Stoicism. It tends to be like the occult is almost all women, and Stoicism is almost all men, and so they are kind of fulfilling different needs in that way. But women don't really resonate with Stoicism at all, and so that's really interesting on a number of levels.
Well, I know we could meander down this really fun tangent forever, but that would spoil the surprise of sitting with the question and seeing what comes up. But thanks again, Britt. This has been really a nourishing conversation.
My pleasure, guys. I hope our paths cross soon again.
Same.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.